By the 9th century, blacksmiths had become essential to every community. They weren't nobles or clergy, but they held a special place of respect. The forge was often located near the village centre, or next to a stable or barn. Why? Because where animals worked, iron was always needed. The blacksmith was the community's problem solver. A broken plough could cripple a harvest. A snapped blade could mean death in battle. So essential was his work that, in some areas, blacksmiths were even exempt from certain feudal duties. Many blacksmiths doubled as farriers, shoers and caretakers of horses. In a world where hoofbeats were the heartbeat of war, trade and travel, this made the smith even more indispensable. Step inside the medieval forge and you enter a world of heat, hissing and hammering. Every inch had a purpose. At the heart was the hearth, a charcoal-fueled fire so hot it could melt iron. The bellows, often made from leather and wood, fed oxygen to the flames and required constant attention. A large anvil, usually mounted on a tree stump, served as the smith's workbench. Then there were the tools, the flatter to smooth metal, the fuller to shape grooves, the hardy, set in the anvil, to cut hot metal, and the swage block, a sort of mould for making curves and standardised shapes. To harden the work, the smith quenched it in water or oil, producing that satisfying hiss we all know. In larger operations, especially near rivers, blacksmiths used trip hammers, massive water-powered hammers that could flatten metal faster than any man. Each tool had its own rhythm, each movement a dance between fire and force. The forge wasn't just functional, it was a theatre of transformation. A blacksmith's life was not easy. Days began at dawn and the work was relentless, physically demanding, scorchingly hot, and often dangerous. Every day brought new challenges. A farmer needed a scythe repaired, a carpenter needed nails, a traveller's horse threw a shoe. Sometimes a soldier came by with a sword that needed sharpening, or reforging. Most blacksmiths had help, usually 1 or 2 apprentices, who started young, sometimes as early as age 12. They learnt not just technique, but the rhythm of the forge, the feel of metal, the timing of heat, the art of endurance. Many forges were family-run. Wives kept the books, helped with sales, and even managed small repairs. Daughters sometimes learned the craft too, though they rarely received formal credit. He crafted and maintained the tools that fed the people. Ploughshares for turning soil, scythes for harvesting grain, axes for felling wood, hoes for planting crops, cauldrons, spits, knives, latches, hooks, all forged by hand, made to last. Many tools weren't sold for money, but bartered, exchanged for food, wool or firewood. The economy of the medieval village was one of trust and trade, and some of these tools were so well made they were passed from father to son. A plough that fed generations, a knife that carved countless meals. Not every blacksmith made weapons. Bladesmiths and armoursmiths were often specialists. But the village blacksmith, he was the battlefield's mechanic. He crafted spearheads and arrowheads, simple swords and battle axes, shield bosses and knife blades. During wartime, his forge rang day and night. Soldiers depended on him. A dulled sword or a cracked helm could mean the difference between victory and death. Some smiths became so skilled their blades were sought after by lords and knights far beyond their village. And occasionally, they inscribed their weapons with mystical runes, symbols meant to protect the wielder or curse the enemy. In fire, the blacksmith gave birth to the tools of survival and destruction. While the blacksmith was vital for tools and weapons, he also had a gentler side, a side that created beauty from brute force. Many smiths took pride in artistic work. They forged decorative gates and railings, hinges, locks and window bars with scrolling motifs, chandeliers, candle holders and church fittings. In some towns, blacksmiths were commissioned by churches or wealthy patrons to create ironwork for cathedrals or castles, an incredible honour and source of income. In medieval minds, the blacksmith held mystical power. He could bend metal, tame fire, and create what no one else could. Folklore swirled around the anvil. In Norse myth, Wayland the Smith was a legendary figure, kidnapped by a king for his skills and later exacting revenge using his craft. In other stories, the blacksmith outwitted the devil himself, tricking him with red-hot iron or trapping him in a horseshoe. Some smiths were believed to have healing powers, particularly for iron-related ailments like blood heat or injuries caused by metal tools. In many villages, the blacksmith acted as a minor doctor. Burnt iron filings mixed with wine, horseshoe water, or the heat of the forge were sometimes used in folk remedies. When war loomed, the blacksmith's role became even more critical. Suddenly nails gave way to arrowheads, ploughshares became pikes. During conflicts, whether regional feuds or major invasions, local smiths worked day and night to equip militias. They repaired broken armour, forged spear tips, and fixed wagons for fleeing families. Some blacksmiths travelled with armies as campaign smiths, setting up mobile forges to keep weapons sharp and horses shod. Becoming a blacksmith wasn't just about strength, it was about patience, discipline, and years of training. Apprenticeships typically began around age 12. The boy would live with the master smith, learning everything from tending the hearth to crafting his first nails. Mistakes were common. Burns, bruises, even scars. But over time, the apprentice learned the secrets of tempering, welding, and shaping. After 5 to 7 years, an apprentice could become a journeyman, travelling between towns to work in different forges, gain skills, and eventually submit a masterwork to join a guild. Guilds ensured quality, trained the next generation, and protected the reputation of the trade. And once accepted, the smith could open his own forge, perhaps with his own apprentice at his side. In the medieval economy, the blacksmith was both craftsman and merchant. While some accepted coins, many preferred barter, tools traded for grain, repairs paid with wool, or knives swapped for chickens. In the Domesday Book of 1086, smiths are specifically listed in many English villages, highlighting just how essential they were to daily economic life. Whether trading, repairing, or commissioning large projects, the blacksmith was a central figure in the heartbeat of commerce. The medieval blacksmith made the tools that built the castle, shoed the horse, forged the sword, and mended the plough. He was a figure of strength, skill, and the essential part of the community. We all know about mead and meat pies, but the medieval world had a sweet tooth too. Perry jelly was a shimmering treat made from fermented pear juice and honey, thickened into a wobbly jelly. The wealthy often spiced it with cinnamon or clove and poured it into moulds shaped like animals or shields. Perry was considered safer to drink than water, and when turned into jelly, it became both medicine and dessert. Frumenti may sound humble, but on feast days it became something magical. This sweetened wheat porridge was enriched with milk, eggs and honey, then topped with dried fruits like figs, raisins and dates. It was traditionally served at Christmas and even accompanied roasted venison during noble feasts. Comfits were the original medieval candy. Fennel, aniseed or coriander seeds were coated in layer after layer of hardened sugar. They were believed to aid digestion, so much so that nobles carried boxes of comfits to banquets and handed them out like party favours. Apple muse was thick, warm and fragrant, a sort of medieval applesauce pudding. Apples were stewed with wine, breadcrumbs and spices like cinnamon and ginger. This dessert was often used to soften stale bread, turning food waste into a sweet, elegant dish. Lèche Lombard was a sliceable custard made from almond milk, honey, and exotic spices like mace and saffron. It looked like fudge but tasted like a warm, nutty pudding. This was a favourite among the nobility, with versions recorded in the 14th century English and Italian cookbooks. Pain perdu, essentially medieval French toast, soaked in egg and milk, fried in butter, then topped with honey or sugar. In a time when wasting bread was unthinkable, pain perdu was a clever and delicious solution. Tarte de Brie was made from soft, ripened cheese, like brie, mixed with eggs, sugar, and spices inside a pastry shell. It was creamy, savoury, and just sweet enough to be served as dessert. It blurs the line between sweet and savoury, much like modern cheesecake. A fleeting spring delight. Elderflower fritters were made by dipping whole blossoms in batter and frying them crisp. Once cooked, they were dusted with sugar or drizzled with honey. Elderflowers bloom for only a short time, so these fritters were a rare seasonal treat, often linked to fertility rituals. Sucket was the medieval answer to fruit candy. Fruits and peels were boiled in sugar syrup with spices, creating sticky, spiced jewels served in ornate bowls. Suckets were served with special silver sucket forks, early utensils for sweets. Chairisai, or cherry eyes, was a rich pudding made from cherries, wine, honey and rice flour. The result was thick, smooth and deeply flavourful. Medieval cooks believed red fruits promoted good health and balanced the humours of the body. Wafers were thin, crispy cakes often eaten with warm spiced wine or fruit syrups. They were a treat for special occasions like weddings or church feasts. They were sometimes printed with religious or noble insignias, a medieval take on edible branding. Doucettes were luxurious egg custards sweetened with honey and perfumed with rosewater or saffron. Baked gently, they had a smooth, almost silky texture. The name comes from the Old French doucette, meaning little sweet thing, and it was often served at the end of high feasts. In medieval times, personal hygiene wasn't what we'd expect today. Bathing was rare for many commoners, partly due to limited access to clean water and the belief that water could carry disease into the body. Soap was handmade from animal fats and ashes and considered a luxury item. Wealthier households might bathe once a week, but for peasants it was often only a few times a year. Despite popular myths, people did try to stay clean using cloths and herbs, but body odour was a part of daily life. While we might picture fluffy loaves of golden bread, most medieval bread was far from appetising. Wheat was expensive, so commoners baked with rye, barley, or oats. In lean times, bakers even added crushed tree bark or ground beans to stretch their flour. This sometimes caused digestive issues or even poisoning. Nobles, by contrast, enjoyed fine white bread called manchette, baked from pure wheat flour and often served with honey or butter. Salt was more than a seasoning in the Middle Ages. It was wealth. Known as white gold, salt preserved meat and fish, making it crucial for survival, especially in winter. At grand feasts where a person sat in relation to the salt cellar marked their rank. Nobles and honoured guests sat above the salt, closer to the host, while servants and lower status individuals were seated below the salt. Its value was so great that Roman soldiers were once paid in salt, giving us the word salary. Medieval evenings were dark, literally. Most homes didn't have windows, and when the sun went down, people relied on candles or oil lamps for light. But candles weren't the scented luxury we know today. They were often made from tallow, a rendered animal fat, which produced thick smoke and a strong odour. Only churches and the very wealthy used beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter. For many, bedtime came shortly after sundown to save on lighting. While cats and dogs were kept for companionship or pest control, medieval households, especially noble ones, sometimes had more exotic pets. Falcons were prized by the upper class, not only for hunting, but also as a symbol of status. Monkeys, squirrels, and even songbirds like nightingales could be found in wealthier homes. These animals were often pampered and even featured in medieval art and literature. Meanwhile, in rural communities, animals like goats and pigs sometimes served dual roles: livestock by day, companions by necessity. The bond between people and their animals, whether practical or affectionate, played a quiet but meaningful role in medieval daily life. A single night's sleep wasn't the norm in the Middle Ages. Historical records suggest that people followed a segmented sleep pattern: first sleep and second sleep. After going to bed at dusk, people would sleep for a few hours, wake around midnight, pray, read, or even visit neighbours, and then go back to sleep until dawn. This pattern matched the natural rhythms of candlelit life and limited daylight. It also allowed people quiet time for reflection in the middle of the night. In medieval times, oral hygiene was quite different from today. People often used herbs like parsley, mint, and rosemary to freshen their breath after meals. Chewing these fragrant herbs helped mask the strong odours caused by less frequent toothbrushing and the heavy diets of the time. Some even made homemade mouthwashes using vinegar or wine infused with herbs. While they lacked modern dental care, these natural remedies were an important part of daily life to maintain some sense of cleanliness and social etiquette. Medieval people did take some care of their teeth. While toothbrushes didn't exist, people used frayed sticks or cloth to rub their teeth clean and remove debris. Interestingly, skeletal remains from the period show relatively healthy teeth, likely due to a lack of processed sugar. Names in the medieval world carried deep meaning. They often reflected a person's trade, like John Smith, location, Alice of York, or a personal trait, Geoffrey the Bold. Nicknames were widely used, especially when multiple people shared the same first name. A Thomas could become Thomas the Miller, Tom Short, or Tomkin. Some surnames stuck for generations, becoming the last names we still use today. While peasants struggled to get enough food, noble banquets were lavish and long-lasting. Feasts were held to celebrate religious holidays, marriages, and military victories, and they didn't end after one course or one evening. Some lasted several days, featuring dozens of dishes, musicians, jugglers, and entertainers. Moulded jellies were served alongside dramatic centerpieces, like pies filled with live birds. These grand spectacles reinforced the wealth and status of the host. What if I told you the medieval diet wasn't just meat, mead, and mouldy bread? Hidden in the pages of ancient manuscripts and castle garden records are fruits you've likely never tasted, fruits that once sweetened royal feasts, flavoured potions, and filled the bowls of peasants and kings alike. Today we're peeling back the centuries to rediscover 12 forgotten fruits of the medieval world. The medlar is the medieval fruit that needed to rot before it could be eaten. Sounds gross? Actually, it's a process called bletting, where the fruit softens and sweetens after harvesting. Once bletted, it has the texture of applesauce and a flavour often compared to spiced dates or baked apples. Shakespeare called it open-arse fruit because, well, take a look. Medlars were a delicacy in Tudor England and often featured in pies and preserves. They also symbolised decay and time, making appearances in poetry and art. Looking like a lumpy apple and smelling like perfume, the quince was once more popular than apples themselves. Too tough and sour to eat raw, quinces were cooked into jellies and pastes like membrillo, still loved in Spain today. In medieval Europe, quince was also prized for its medicinal properties. It was believed to aid digestion, sweeten breath, and even strengthen the heart. Also known as Juneberries, these small blue-purple fruits taste like a mix of blueberries and almonds. They were often foraged by villagers and baked into rustic tarts. Their name may come from Appalachian funerals. Service berries bloomed when the ground thawed enough to hold burial services. Sloe berries are as medieval as chainmail. These tart fruits from the blackthorn tree were turned into syrups, vinegars, and the ancestor of modern sloe gin. People never ate them raw. They're far too astringent. Instead, they were steeped in alcohol or sweetened with honey to bring out their deep, plummy flavour. The cornelian cherry may look like a cranberry, but its taste is tangy and citrusy, like sour cherry and lime. Popular in Byzantine and Eastern European cuisines, this fruit was often made into jams, fermented drinks, and even pickled. Romans loved it too. Legions carried the tough wood for spears and the fruit for energy. Mulberries were so beloved in the Middle Ages, some monasteries cultivated them for their sweet juice and for silkworms, which feed exclusively on mulberry leaves. The black mulberry, in particular, was eaten fresh, dried, or turned into wine, and they stain everything, a symbol of fleeting beauty and often linked to ancient myths like Pyramus and Thisbe. Tiny, tangy, and electric red, barberries were prized for their zing. Used in medieval sauces and syrups, they also served medicinal purposes, especially for fevers. Though banned in some areas due to a link to wheat diseases, they remained popular in kitchens and gardens until forgotten by modern diets. Damsons are the dark horse of the plum family. Tart and tannic, they were perfect for stewing with meat, making jams and even flavouring ale. The name may trace back to Damascus, suggesting a long journey from the Middle East to the English orchard. Yes, jujubes are real fruit, not just chewy candy. Known as the Chinese date, they were brought to Europe via the Silk Road. Dried, they're chewy and date-like. Fresh, they're crisp and apple-like. Medieval herbalists valued them for calming the nerves and aiding sleep. The strawberry tree, or Arbutus unidu, was said to be eaten once because the taste was forgettable. But these fruits were fermented into wines and liqueurs by monks and foragers. It's one of the few fruits that ripens in autumn and blooms at the same time, making it a symbol of rebirth and duality. Rowan berries were more than food, they were magic. Medieval people believed the tree protected against witches and evil spirits. When cooked, the bitter berries made excellent jelly, often paired with game meats. In hard times, they were dried and ground into flour substitutes. Also called the wild service tree, this fruit tastes like dates and malt after bletting. Checker fruits were fermented into a kind of rustic cider or ale, and inns named the Checkers across Britain reference this very tree. They were so culturally tied to drinking that they lent their name to the Chancellor's residence, Chequers. And though many faded from our tables, they still grow in hedgerows and old gardens, waiting for curious minds to rediscover their taste. We've all heard of medieval meat pies and mead, but what about the vegetables that filled the tables of castles, monasteries, and peasant homes? Today we're looking into history to unearth 12 forgotten vegetables of the medieval world. Some were culinary staples, others medicinal marvels. All are rare in modern kitchens. Skirret, funny name, serious flavour. This sweet white root, with its mild taste reminiscent of carrot and parsnip, was a favourite in medieval kitchens. The name skirret comes from the Dutch suikerwortel, or sugar root, a nod to its natural sweetness. Boiled, roasted, or even fried in batter, skirret was considered a delicacy of the elite. Charlemagne reportedly demanded it in his royal gardens. It's a perennial too, meaning once planted, it fed people for years. With a name fit for royalty and a nickname of poor man's asparagus, Good King Henry was a reliable wild green. This plant was often foraged near homes and farms, leading it to be one of the earliest homegrown vegetables of Europe. Its young shoots were eaten like asparagus, while the mature leaves were cooked like spinach. Before celery ruled the kitchen, there was Alexander's. Grown by Romans and passed on through the medieval period, this bold, peppery herb flavoured everything from soups to salted fish. It was so popular that it was often planted along monastery walls, and nearly every part is edible: root, leaf, stem, and flower. Recognise the name rampion. You might know it as Rapunzel. Yes, that Rapunzel. In the fairy tale, her mother craved this plant so badly, she risked everything. That's because rampion's root is nutty and tender, and its leaves can be eaten raw or cooked. It was such a valuable salad plant that theft from noble gardens was not uncommon. Don't let the appearance fool you. Scortonera, also known as black salsify, has a creamy oyster-like flavour when cooked. Its name means viper's herb in Spanish, due to its supposed ability to treat snake bites. Once considered a cure for the plague, it was a prized root in both culinary and apothecary gardens. Blanched and buried in sand, sea kale shoots were a coastal treasure. This seaside vegetable was a staple in monastic gardens, especially in the British Isles. In Victorian times, it made a comeback and was considered a gourmet delicacy in Britain. What if you could eat your parsley from the bottom up? Parsley root is a forgotten cousin of the common herb, cultivated for its white, aromatic root. Used in broths, stews, and even sweet dishes, it had a parsley meets carrot flavour. Medieval cooks favoured it over carrots, in regions where orange carrots had yet to dominate the field. While we still eat turnips, the greens often go to waste, but in the medieval world, they were essential. Boiled, pickled, or sautéed with vinegar and spices, turnip tops were rich in nutrients and flavour. Turnip greens were so valued that crop rotation systems were designed in part to ensure their steady supply. Strong, savoury, and celery-like, lovage was the medieval MSG. Used to flavour broths, meats and sauces, it was also brewed into teas and digestive tonics. Monks planted it widely for both food and medicine. Think lettuce is just for salads? Meet cheltus, a variety grown for its crunchy, juicy stem. It was often peeled and stir-fried, and its mild, nutty flavour made it popular in Asia and parts of southern Europe. Though Celtus faded from European fields, it's still popular in Chinese cuisine today. With a taste like sweet chestnuts and parsnip, chervil root was a prized winter food. It was slow to grow but stored well, ideal for lean months in medieval climates. This root was so delicate in flavour that nobles reserved it for fine stews and feast day dishes. We still use the root to spice up our roasts, but in medieval times, horseradish leaves were just as important. Their peppery bite added kick to meat pies, sausages, and fresh salads. Beyond food, horseradish was thought to cure everything from scurvy to snake bites. Truly a hot commodity, from castle banquets to peasant stews, these vegetables once fed medieval Europe with flavour, variety, and vital nutrients. Welcome to the chaos and charm of the Middle Ages. We will explore the myths, monsters, and mysteries from medieval times. These legends shaped real beliefs, inspired crusades, and defined times. While the sword in the stone tale might sound far-fetched, many historians believe the legend was inspired by an actual war leader from the 5th or 6th century. This mysterious figure supposedly led British forces against Saxon invaders, laying the foundation for centuries of Arthurian legends. To medieval minds, dragons weren't just fantasy, they were facts. Bestiaries and maps marked unexplored lands with warnings like "Here be dragons." Caves, mountain ranges and distant islands were all fair game for dragon sightings. Elves, goblins and fairies were not the magical helpers we think of today. Back then they were blamed for stolen children, sudden sickness, or strange happenings in the woods. Folklore was filled with warnings of these dangerous beings. The Holy Grail wasn't just a symbol of divine power, it was the ultimate medieval obsession. Knights of the Round Table, including Sir Galahad and Sir Lancelot, were said to seek this mystical chalice, believed to hold the blood of Christ. The search became a metaphor for purity, sacrifice, and divine favour. Medieval people truly believed in revenants, restless spirits or walking corpses. Ghost stories were not just spooky tales, but moral warnings about unresolved sins, improper burials, or divine punishment. Unicorns, manticores, and even the dreaded basilisk appeared in real medieval texts. Scholars of the time included them in encyclopedias, treating them as exotic animals rather than mythical monsters. These travelling performers kept legends alive, spinning tales of heroism, betrayal, magic, and war. Their stories were entertainment, history, and moral lesson all rolled into one. Merlin wasn't just a magician in stories. Some medieval people believed he had actually existed and possessed prophetic powers. Chronicles and religious texts sometimes referred to him as a sage who foresaw great wars and the rise of kings. The tale of Beowulf slaying Grendel and a fire-breathing dragon is one of the earliest surviving epic poems in English. While clearly legendary, it also reflects the real warrior culture of early medieval Scandinavia and England. A solar eclipse wasn't just a natural event, it was a warning. Medieval people believed celestial signs were divine messages. Comets could signal the death of a king. Blood moons foretold war. The sky was, quite literally, the news. The medieval world wasn't just built on stone and steel, it was built on stories. Legends weren't just entertainment, they were how people explained the unexplainable. Which legend do you believe has some truth to it? Battles were often decided by cavalry. Heavily armoured knights on trained war horses could break enemy lines with sheer force, making them the backbone of medieval armies. While longbows were powerful, many medieval battles were decided through disciplined formations like shield walls. Lines of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked together, creating a human barrier that could withstand cavalry charges and incoming arrows. Strength in unity was key. Sieges were long, painful campaigns. Castles were assaulted with catapults, battering rams, and siege towers, some sieges dragging on for months until starvation forced surrender. Medieval armies didn't just rely on brute force, they also got creative with fire. Archers used fire arrows to set siege equipment, and enemy camps ablaze, and early forms of gunpowder were sometimes packed into small devices to create chaos and confusion during battle. Before full suits of plate, knights wore chainmail. Flexible and protective, it covered most of the body, but wasn't foolproof against heavy strikes from maces or axes. Crossbows were so powerful, they were banned by some religious leaders. Though slower to reload, their armour-piercing bolts made them one of the deadliest weapons of the age. Castles were built for defence with moats, drawbridges, and thick walls. Designed to withstand even the most determined attacks, they were a nightmare for invading armies. Not all soldiers fought for honour. Many were mercenaries. These hired swords fought for coin and could even betray their employers if the price was right. War horses weren't just transportation. They were trained for battle. They could kick, bite, and trample enemies, making them a powerful asset in the chaos of war. Even in wartime, peace had its moments. The church imposed truce days, banning combat on Sundays and religious holidays in an attempt to curb constant bloodshed. Winter in medieval times was brutal, and for peasants, survival depended on their homes being as warm as possible despite their simple construction. These dwellings were small, one-room structures made of wattle and daub, a framework of woven wooden strips covered in a thick layer of mud, clay, and straw. This method provided basic insulation, though walls often cracked, allowing cold drafts to seep through. The roofs, made of thatch, were packed tightly with dried straw, offering some protection from the elements, though leaks and infestations were common. The heart of every peasant home was the hearth, which served as the sole source of warmth and a cooking area. Fireplaces lacked chimneys, so smoke filled the room, before eventually escaping through small openings in the walls or the thatched roof. This made the air thick and difficult to breathe, irritating eyes and lungs. To combat the cold, families huddled around the fire, absorbing as much heat as possible. To improve insulation, peasants stuffed straw and mud into wall gaps and hung thick cloths or animal hides over doors and windows to block out the wind. Some homes had wooden shutters that could be closed at night for extra protection. During especially harsh winters, livestock such as cows, sheep, and chickens were brought inside, providing additional warmth through body heat. At night, staying warm was a priority. Families slept together in a single bed under layers of wool blankets or furs. Reed and rush flooring provided insulation against the cold ground, with some homes incorporating dried herbs like lavender for freshness. Those who could afford it used raised wooden platforms or straw mattresses, avoiding the damp and frigid earth beneath them. Despite the harsh conditions, medieval peasants adapted their homes to retain warmth, making small but crucial adjustments that ensured their survival during the coldest months. Clothing in medieval times was not just for modesty or protection, it was a critical tool for survival. Peasants relied on layers to keep warm, with wool being the most common material. Woolen tunics and cloaks were worn throughout the winter months, providing insulation against the cold. Tunics were long and loose-fitting, allowing additional layers underneath, while cloaks fastened at the neck provided extra coverage. Fur, though largely reserved for the wealthy, found its way into peasant clothing in small amounts. Those who could afford it lined their mittens, boots or hats with fur to provide warmth. For the rest, wool remained the primary defence against the cold. Hoods and hats were essential, as heat escapes rapidly from the head. Many wore woolen caps or hoods with long tails that could be wrapped around the neck like a scarf, offering extra insulation. Beneath their outer layers, peasants typically wore linen underclothes, which helped wick moisture away from the body. Staying dry was crucial, as damp clothing could lead to illness. Footwear options were limited. Leather shoes were expensive and wore out quickly in muddy conditions. Many relied on wooden clogs or simply wrapped their feet in rags, stuffing them with straw or wool to keep warm. A particularly useful feature of medieval winter clothing was the inclusion of removable layers. Some garments were designed with inner linings that could be added or removed as needed, allowing peasants to adjust to fluctuating temperatures. This practical approach to dressing allowed them to stay warm while maintaining mobility for daily work. Surviving the winter required careful planning and food storage. Without modern refrigeration, peasants relied on time-tested preservation methods to ensure they had enough to eat. Meats were salted, smoked, or dried to prevent spoilage, while root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were stored in underground pits lined with straw to keep them fresh. Grains such as barley and rye were stored in sacks and used for making bread and porridge throughout the season. Drinking water was risky due to contamination, so ale was the primary beverage. Even children drank it, as the fermentation process made it safer than water. Though weak in alcohol content, it provided essential calories and warmth. To avoid running out of food, peasants practiced fasting and rationing. Meals were carefully portioned, and every bit of food was used efficiently. This meant reusing bones for broth, stretching ingredients into soups, and finding creative ways to make supplies last through the long months of scarcity. The agricultural cycle slowed significantly, leaving only a few hardy crops like cabbage, leeks, and root vegetables, which could still be harvested from frozen ground. This limited yield became a crucial supplement to their stored food for survival through the cold months. With the fields frozen and many tasks on hold, peasants turned their efforts inward. A significant portion of the day was devoted to maintenance work, repairing buildings, fixing tools, and ensuring that homes were weatherproofed against the harsh winter elements. The bitter cold made fires essential for warmth and cooking, so gathering firewood became one of the most important chores. Every able-bodied member of the household, from the elderly to the children, would help gather what little dry wood could be found. The constant effort to stockpile fuel kept everyone occupied, but it was never truly enough to last the entire winter, requiring regular trips to the forest or woodpile. Another necessary task in winter was caring for livestock. Without access to fresh pasture, feeding animals became more difficult, and the winter diet of hay and grain was not always sufficient. Peasants spent time ensuring that the animals, cows, sheep, goats, and pigs, had enough food to survive the season. Though some animals, like chickens, could be kept in small coops near the warmth of the hearth, others were housed in barns where constant attention was required to prevent frostbite or illnesses. The cold months also offered peasants the time to complete indoor tasks that had been put off during the busy harvest season. Women would spin wool, weave fabric, and mend clothing that had been worn thin during the previous year. Clothes were carefully patched up to avoid any waste, as any fabric, thread, or cloth was precious. Shoes, often worn until the soles were worn through, were repaired by cobblers or by the peasants themselves. The need for warmth extended beyond clothing. With less work to be done outdoors, social life became crucial in maintaining both physical and mental health. Peasants gathered in the evenings around the fire, telling stories, singing songs, and sharing news. Families would visit each other, exchanging food, drink, and occasionally small gifts. The communal nature of life was not just a way to pass the time. These gatherings helped to preserve the social fabric of the community, offering much-needed companionship in the otherwise isolated and bleak months. Villages often had communal ovens where families could bake their bread. These ovens were places of warmth. The smell of baking bread would fill the village, and for a brief moment, it provided a respite from the cold. Bread was often shared, with each family contributing to the oven schedule, ensuring that everyone had something to eat. While most foraging and hunting was halted by the deep snow, peasants still ventured out when necessary. Small game, such as rabbits and squirrels, could be found in the woods. Birds, including pheasants and ducks, might also be trapped or hunted. However, the bitter cold and scarcity of resources meant that many peasants simply relied on stored food. Salted meats, preserved vegetables, and dried fruits became staples of the winter diet. With fewer opportunities for fresh produce, the monotony of winter meals could sometimes be overwhelming. The tight-knit nature of the village meant that people depended on each other in times of need. When one family ran low on firewood, others would share their supply. If one household had excess grain, they might trade it for wool, firewood, or other supplies. This system of bartering was essential to survival. There was no reliable cash economy for peasants, and many villagers lacked the luxury of money, so exchange of goods and services was their primary means of acquiring what they needed. Monasteries and churches played a pivotal role during the cold months. Not only did they provide spiritual guidance, but they also served as safe havens for those who had nowhere else to turn. The poor, the sick, and the elderly often found shelter in the church or the abbey, where they could receive a meal and warmth. Churches would often hold masses or offer prayers for favourable weather and the health of the community. Some monasteries even maintained large storerooms filled with grain and dried meat, which they distributed to the needy. Festivals were another vital aspect of winter survival. Despite the grueling conditions, religious celebrations like Christmas and Twelfth Night provided peasants with a much-needed break from the hardships of the season. These festivals were filled with food, drink, dancing, and singing. They were a brief respite from the cold and isolation, reminding people of their shared humanity and the promise of spring. Superstitions also played a large role in winter survival. Many peasants believed that the harshness of winter, illness, and even bad harvests could be influenced by supernatural forces. Offering prayers to saints, burning special herbs, or lighting candles at particular times were all ways to ward off evil spirits. Some would also hold rituals at the winter solstice, hoping for a prosperous and mild year ahead. The cold weather, combined with the lack of sunlight and limited nutrition, made medieval winters a breeding ground for illness. Peasants were particularly vulnerable to diseases like pneumonia, colds, and coughs. The long dark nights led to a rise in frostbite and other cold-related injuries, especially for those who had to work outdoors. Medieval medicine was rudimentary at best, and many illnesses went untreated or were wrongly diagnosed. Colds and fevers were often seen as punishments from God or the result of spirits. Village healers or herbalists would concoct various remedies using herbs like thyme, rosemary, and garlic. These remedies were thought to have medicinal properties, but often they were little more than soothing concoctions to ease discomfort. Warm teas made from honey, ginger, and elderberry might offer some relief from cold symptoms, and poultices made of crushed herbs were applied to sore throats and aching joints. In addition to herbal remedies, some peasants believed in charms or spells to stave off illness. A simple charm, an offering of bread, or a prayer to a saint was often as effective as any remedy. The belief in divine protection was strong. Many peasants prayed for health, guidance, and protection during the long, cold nights. The winter months could also bring outbreaks of more serious diseases, such as the plague, which could spread quickly through tightly packed villages. Without modern antibiotics or vaccines, villagers could do little to prevent or treat the spread of disease. It was often the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and the weak, who succumbed to illness first. Death from cold, hunger, or disease was a constant threat in these months. Though the winter months were long, cold, and harsh, the faith of the peasants helped them to endure the darkness, knowing that eventually the warmth of spring would return. The medieval world was a place where justice was often brutal, unfair, and terrifying. From bizarre trials to horrifying executions, the punishments of the time reflected a society that believed suffering could reveal the truth. If someone was accused of a crime, they didn't get a fair trial. Instead, they faced trial by ordeal. This could mean holding a red-hot iron, walking across burning coals, or being thrown into a freezing river. If they survived or healed quickly, it meant God had judged them innocent. If not, their guilt was proven, and they were punished, often by execution. For lesser crimes, people were put in stocks or pillories, wooden frames that locked their heads and hands in place in the town square. There they were pelted with rotten food, mud, and even stones by angry crowds. This punishment wasn't just about suffering, it was meant to shame criminals so they wouldn't repeat their offences. Anyone suspected of witchcraft faced torture, forced confessions, and execution. Many were burned at the stake or hanged. Some trials used the ordeal by water, where the accused was thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. Either way, survival was unlikely. Believe it or not, animals could be charged with crimes like destroying crops, attacking people, or even stealing. There are records of pigs being executed, goats being put on trial, and even insects being sentenced for damaging harvests. These trials were taken just as seriously as human cases. While peasants were punished for the smallest crimes, nobles often had private armies and could ignore the king's laws. They settled disputes with bribery, duels, or outright violence. If a noble did commit a crime, they were more likely to be banished or fined rather than executed. Poisoning was a serious fear, especially among the wealthy. To protect themselves, kings and nobles hired food testers, people who took the first bite of a meal to make sure it wasn't poisoned. If the tester survived, the food was considered safe. If not, well, it was time to find a new tester. Instead of going to court, people could fight to prove their innocence. Trial by combat was a legal way to settle accusations. Whoever won was considered right in the eyes of the law. Even minor disputes could be settled with swords, and sometimes the fight was to the death. Stealing wasn't taken lightly in the medieval world. Even petty theft, like stealing a loaf of bread, could lead to a harsh punishment, including hanging. The idea was that harsh penalties would scare people into obedience, but it often meant poor people faced death for minor crimes. Making fake coins was one of the worst crimes a person could commit. Since money was directly tied to the king's power, counterfeiting was seen as an act of treason. The punishment? Being thrown into a cauldron of boiling water or oil. Some trials were based entirely on pain and survival. In ordeal by fire, the accused had to carry a burning hot object. If their wounds healed, they were innocent. In ordeal by water, the accused was tied up and tossed into a river. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. Grab your sword, strap on your armour, and let's ride into battle. Think castles were just grand stone homes. Think again. Defending a castle was brutal, and one of the sneakiest defences was murder holes. These were gaps in the ceiling where defenders could dump boiling oil, molten lead, or even rocks on invaders trying to storm the gates. If you ever wanted to take a swim in a medieval moat, don't. Most castle toilets, called garderobes, were simple stone seats with holes, leading directly into the moat. Yep, the same water that protected the castle from enemies was also filled with human waste. So if you were a soldier sieging a castle, not only were you dodging arrows, but you were also standing next to a giant medieval toilet. Becoming a knight wasn't just about wearing cool armour and swinging swords. It took a lifetime of training. Boys as young as 7 years old became pages, working under knights and learning basic combat skills. By 14, they became squires, training harder, polishing armour, and assisting in real battles. If they survived all that, they were knighted around age 21. No participation trophies here. If you couldn't keep up, you were out. Ever heard the myth that knights in full armour couldn't move? That's completely false. A full suit of plate armour weighed 80 to 100 pounds, but it was so well designed that knights could run, climb, and even do somersaults in it. Some knights even wrestled and fought on foot in full armour, proving that they weren't just walking tin cans. Jousting wasn't just a sport, it was a death match on horseback. 2 knights charged at full speed, aiming their lances to shatter on impact. Even though they used blunt lances, knights often died from broken necks, concussions, or even splinters piercing their eyes. In one famous case, King Henry II of France was killed in a joust when a lance splintered through his eye socket. Talk about a painful way to go. The longbow was one of the deadliest weapons of the Middle Ages. Unlike short bows, these could pierce knight armour from over 200 yards away. At the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, English longbowmen decimated the French knights, proving that you didn't need heavy armour to win battles. You just needed a really, really big bow. Castles were built for defence, but if things got too dangerous, lords had hidden tunnels to escape a siege. These tunnels, called sally ports, led to secret exits beyond the castle walls, allowing defenders to sneak out, surprise the enemy, or even escape unnoticed. So if you ever feel trapped, just remember, medieval lords had a backup plan. Not all knights served kings, some joined mysterious warrior orders. The Knights Templar, Teutonic Knights, and Hospitallers were elite warriors sworn to protect pilgrims and fight in holy wars. Many of these knights became legendary, with some believing they guarded sacred relics like the Holy Grail. Their secrets remain shrouded in mystery, with some even inspiring legends of hidden treasure. Forget soccer or basketball. If you were a noble in medieval times, your favourite sport was hunting with falcons. Falconry was a status symbol, with trained birds hunting rabbits, pheasants, and even small deer. Only the wealthiest nobles could afford rare falcons from the Middle East, making them a prized possession in medieval courts. Think of it as having a luxury sports car, except it's a bird. Dogs and horses were common nightly pets, but some took it to the next level. They kept bears as pets. Knights returning from wars sometimes brought back exotic animals. Some even trained bears for hunting, or had them fight in tournaments for entertainment. Imagine riding into battle with a trained war bear. Now that's medieval madness. Medicine in the Middle Ages was questionable at best. If you were sick, your chances of survival depended more on luck than actual science. Let's take a look at some of the wildest medical practices and superstitions of medieval times. Feeling sick? Just drain some blood. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments for everything. Fevers, headaches, infections, you name it. The idea was that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids, so removing blood would rebalance the body. Problem was, it often made people weaker, or even killed them. Believe it or not, medieval doctors tasted urine to diagnose illnesses. They believed the colour, smell, and taste revealed a patient's condition. Imagine walking into a doctor's office today and being handed a cup of pee for a taste test. Yeah, hard pass. The Black Death was the deadliest pandemic in history, wiping out nearly 50% of Europe's population in just a few years. But what caused it? Some believed it was bad air, others blamed angry gods or even witchcraft. People carried flowers or burned herbs to purify the air, none of which helped, of course. These guys, they weren't just creepy, they believed their beaked masks, stuffed with herbs, would protect them from the deadly disease. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Ever had a headache so bad you'd drill a hole in your head? Well, medieval doctors did just that. This practice, called trepanning, was meant to release evil spirits causing mental illness, seizures, or migraines, and somehow, people survived this. Before modern medicine, many treatments were a mix of herbs, magic spells, and crushed gemstones. Yup, some believed powdered gems could cure disease, while others relied on charms and prayers to heal. Let's just say medical school wasn't really a thing back then. Forget modern hospitals. Medieval ones were more like shelters run by monks. They provided food and a place to rest. But actual medical care? Not so much. If you got better, great. If not, well, prayers were your best hope. Believe it or not, people thought that kings had healing powers. It was called the king's touch, and rulers were believed to cure diseases like scrofula just by laying their hands on the sick. Did it work? Probably not. But hey, it gave people hope. Of all the bizarre treatments, leeches are still used today. In medieval times, they were placed on wounds to suck out bad blood and prevent infection. Turns out modern doctors actually use leeches in surgery to improve circulation, one of the few medieval treatments that wasn't complete nonsense. Giving birth in medieval times was dangerous, so midwives relied on prayers, amulets, and herbal remedies to protect mothers and babies. Superstition and medicine often went hand in hand, because back then, any bit of luck was needed to survive. Welcome to a world long past but still brimming with life and stories. The medieval tavern. Imagine stepping into a space where the warm glow of candlelight reflects off wooden beams. The air is rich with the aroma of roasted meats and ale, and the room hums with laughter, conversation, and the occasional burst of a bard's tune. So grab a seat by the fire, raise a tankard, and join us as we step into the lively world of the medieval tavern. Taverns were far more than just places to eat and drink. They were essential stops for weary travellers, offering shelter, a warm meal, and a safe place to rest for the night. For merchants on long journeys, they provided opportunities to network, trade goods, and share news from distant lands. There were different types of taverns catering to various needs. The most common were ale houses, humble establishments frequented by peasants and labourers. Here, the focus was simple: a hearty drink and basic food to keep you going. Inns, on the other hand, offered more amenities, including lodging for travellers who needed a place to stay overnight. For the wealthy and noble class, high-end establishments provided finer accommodations, often with imported wines and exotic foods to suit their refined tastes. Taverns weren't just for individuals passing through. They often acted as informal community centres. Locals would gather to discuss village matters, celebrate special occasions, or even hold town meetings. In some cases, taverns doubled as courtrooms, where disputes were settled over a mug of ale. Tavern signs played a crucial role in medieval towns. Since many people couldn't read, these signs used symbols to represent the establishment. A red lion, a swan, or a cluster of grapes would signify a place to stop for a drink. They also helped travellers find their way in an unfamiliar town. Food and drink were the cornerstone of any good tavern experience, and the menu was as diverse as the patrons themselves. The staple dish of the time was pottage, a thick, hearty stew made from vegetables, grains, and sometimes meat if you could afford it. For those who preferred something simpler, trenchers were a common choice. These were slices of stale bread used as makeshift plates, absorbing the juices of whatever meal was served on them. Bread was a constant on the table, though it was often coarse and made from barley or rye. It was frequently paired with cheese or preserved meats, staples that could be stored and eaten throughout the year. Wealthier patrons, however, enjoyed more luxurious fare, such as roasted meats seasoned with exotic spices like cinnamon or cloves, a sign of wealth and status. And of course, no tavern visit was complete without a drink. Ale and beer were by far the most popular choices, brewed locally and often by women known as alewives. Ale was a safer alternative to water, as the brewing process involved boiling, which killed harmful bacteria. Mead, made from fermented honey, was another favourite, along with cider and wine, depending on the region and the tavern's clientele. In medieval times, drinking was more than just quenching thirst. It was a communal activity. Sharing a drink was a way to build trust and camaraderie, and toasts were often made to health, prosperity, or safe travels. It was also about entertainment. Taverns were places where people could unwind, have fun, and sometimes even try their luck. Dice games like Hazard were extremely popular. A simple roll of the dice could determine the winner of a bet, and with gambling being widespread, the stakes often ran high. Board games like Nine Men's Morris, a strategy game similar to modern checkers, were also common and brought patrons together in friendly competition. For those who preferred physical challenges, outdoor games like archery contests or throwing competitions offered entertainment and a chance to show off their skills. These events often drew crowds, creating a festive atmosphere. Performances were another highlight of tavern life. Minstrels and bards entertained patrons with songs, tales of heroism, and even the latest news from afar. Occasionally, travelling actors or jesters would stop by to perform comedic skits, adding humour to the evening's revelry. Gambling was a common pastime, whether on games, contests, or even on each other's skills. But to ensure fairness, some taverns implemented their own house rules, a set of guidelines that kept disputes to a minimum and the games running smoothly. Entertainment and games were the heartbeat of a medieval tavern, bringing people together and creating memories that would be shared for years to come. Justice in the Middle Ages was both brutal and unforgiving. Theft could lead to hanging, even for something as small as a loaf of bread. If you were accused of a crime, you might face trial by ordeal, where guilt or innocence was determined by divine intervention. For example, suspects might be forced to carry a red-hot iron in their hands and walk 3 meters. If the wound healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. If not, you'd already be condemned. For lesser crimes, public humiliation was the order of the day. Stocks and pillories were commonplace, and villagers were encouraged to throw rotten food, or worse, at the accused. Prisons, when used, were horrifically unsanitary, often becoming a death sentence in themselves due to disease and neglect. The concept of mercy was virtually non-existent, and the punishments meted out served as gruesome deterrents for would-be offenders. If you weren't born into wealth, your life was one of endless toil and hardship. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land and their lord. Your day began before sunrise and ended well after sunset, spent ploughing fields, harvesting crops, or tending livestock. In return, you kept just enough to survive, with much of your yield going to the Lord and the church, as taxes or tithes. Even in good years, food was basic: coarse bread, watery pottage, and occasional vegetables. Meat was rare for the lower classes, as hunting was reserved for nobles. If crops failed, as they often did due to poor weather or pests, famine was inevitable. Malnutrition weakened entire communities, leaving them vulnerable to diseases, while back-breaking labour took a heavy toll on bodies. For women, life in the Middle Ages was doubly harsh. They were often viewed as morally weak and subservient to men, a perception deeply rooted in religious teachings of the time. Daily life revolved around relentless domestic chores: spinning, weaving, brewing ale, and managing the household. Rural women also toiled in the fields alongside men, while noble women oversaw estates but had little personal freedom. Marriage was rarely about love. Women were seen as property, exchanged in marriages to secure alliances or improve social standing. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death. Without pain relief or proper medical knowledge, complications often proved fatal for both mother and child. Midwives and herbal remedies were the only resources available, but they could do little against infections or difficult labours. The constant cycle of childbearing, illness and societal oppression left women with little reprieve from hardship. You would also notice that you wouldn't understand a single word. The common folk spoke Middle English, a dialect so foreign that it's nearly incomprehensible to modern ears. The elite communicated in French, and the clergy relied on Latin for prayers, documents, and sermons. These language barriers alone would make survival incredibly difficult. Even if you managed to communicate, literacy was a rare luxury. Only about 10% of men and 1% of women could read or write. Books were hand-copied, expensive treasures reserved for the wealthy or religious institutions. Most knowledge was passed down orally, creating an environment where misinformation and superstition flourished. Symbols and pictures helped bridge gaps, but they'd hardly prepare you for navigating this unfamiliar world. Childhood in the Middle Ages was a perilous journey fraught with danger. Nearly 1/3 of children didn't survive past the age of 5, falling victim to diseases like dysentery, measles, or whooping cough. The lack of medical knowledge, poor sanitation, and malnutrition only compounded the risks. Even in the womb, survival wasn't guaranteed. Poor diets during pregnancy led to complications, and women often consumed alcohol, unaware of its risks. For the lucky few who made it to adulthood, life was still harsh. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, though those who survived childhood illnesses and avoided war or famine could live longer. Still, the relentless hardships of the era ensured that few experienced a truly comfortable existence. Medieval Europe was rarely at peace. Wars between kingdoms and local lords were constant, and peasants were often conscripted to fight. Armed with little more than farm tools or crude weapons, they faced professional soldiers and brutal tactics. Casualties were high, and even if you survived the battlefield, the aftermath of war brought famine, disease, and economic ruin. The Crusades, the 100 Years' War, and countless smaller skirmishes claimed millions of lives. Villages were razed, livestock stolen, and fields burned, leaving entire communities destitute. The horrors of war weren't confined to the battlefield. Civilians often bore the brunt of the violence, living in perpetual fear of raids and invasions. Even the wealthy weren't immune to the dangers of medieval life. Fancy glazed pottery and leaded goblets were common at noble tables, but they often leached lead into food and drink. Chronic lead poisoning caused symptoms such as headaches, memory loss, and even death. Bread, a staple for rich and poor alike, sometimes carried ergot fungus, which caused ergotism. Symptoms included hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Outbreaks of ergotism could devastate entire villages and may have inspired tales of witchcraft or mass hysteria. The combination of poor hygiene, contaminated food, and toxic materials created an environment where health was constantly jeopardized. The Middle Ages were a far cry from the romanticized tales we imagine. Disease, famine, violence, and ignorance defined daily life, and even the wealthy faced dangers unimaginable today. While we admire the art, architecture, and traditions of the period, one thing is clear: surviving even a single day in the Dark Ages would be a monumental challenge. The year is 1347. A mysterious and deadly disease has swept across Europe. Known as the Black Death, this pandemic comprised 3 forms of plague: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. Together they ravaged the continent, reducing its population by as much as 50%. The question is, could you have survived? We'll explore the methods, some ingenious, others harsh, that might have kept you alive. Through these historical lessons, we uncover strategies for resilience that still hold relevance today. The pneumonic plague spread through airborne droplets, while the bubonic variety relied on fleas carried by rats. Urban centres, with their crowded streets, poor sanitation, and abundant rodent populations, became epicentres of the pandemic. To survive, the first rule was clear: stay away from the cities. Those who lived in rural areas or could escape to isolated villages significantly increased their chances of survival. Cities were hotbeds of infection, with dense populations exacerbating the rapid transmission of disease. For many, retreating to the countryside wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. Think of this as a medieval form of social distancing. Avoiding crowded markets, bustling taverns, and public festivals reduced exposure to infected individuals and flea-infested rodents. Isolation from these urban centres proved to be one of the most effective survival strategies. The practice of quarantine, a concept still used today, has its roots in the Black Death. In Venice, authorities required incoming ships to anchor offshore for 40 days, a practice known as 40 giorni, the origin of the word quarantine. This delay allowed time to identify and isolate potential carriers of the plague, reducing the risk of contagion. In Milan, officials took more extreme measures. Entire households displaying symptoms were sealed inside their homes. While this condemned many to die in isolation, it significantly lowered the city's mortality rate compared to other regions. These severe strategies demonstrate the lengths to which societies would go to curb the disease's spread. Contact with the deceased posed a significant risk. Corpses remained highly infectious, and the overwhelming number of deaths led to mass graves. In Florence, bodies were buried in layers with dirt between them, creating what one chronicler described as a human lasagna. Such practices underscore the desperation of the era. Specialised groups known as bechini were tasked with handling the dead. Their work was both essential and perilous, as many succumbed to the plague themselves. Some even turned to theft and violence, adding to the chaos. For the average person, avoiding contact with both the dead and those who managed them was a critical survival tactic. Fire served purposes beyond providing warmth. Pope Clement VI famously surrounded himself with a ring of flames, which likely kept infected individuals and disease-carrying fleas at bay. This unintentional method of disease prevention proved effective. Later, fire played a role in eradicating the plague from London. The Great Fire of 1666 destroyed much of the city's rat population, breaking the cycle of transmission. This historical example highlights how natural or deliberate actions can have unintended public health benefits. Plague doctors donned distinctive outfits, including bird-like masks filled with aromatic herbs. These masks were intended to filter miasma, or bad air, believed to carry the disease. Though scientifically inaccurate, the protective gear may have offered some defence against flea bites. The leather coats, gloves and masks represented early attempts at personal protective equipment. While these measures were limited by the era's medical knowledge, they symbolised the ongoing effort to combat the plague. Good health was a valuable ally. Poor nutrition, unsanitary living conditions, and pre-existing illnesses heightened vulnerability to the plague. Acts like consuming fresh produce, maintaining personal hygiene, and staying active helped bolster natural defences. Though rooted more in practicality than science, these habits illustrate the connection between lifestyle and immunity. Even then, people understood the importance of physical well-being in the face of disease. Survival wasn't solely a matter of strategy. Genetic predispositions played a crucial role. Some individuals carried genetic traits that enhanced their resistance to Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. Believing that foul air carried the disease, people burned incense and aromatic herbs to purify their surroundings. While ineffective against infection, these practices reflect early attempts to mitigate environmental risks and provide psychological comfort. The Black Death reshaped Europe and left a legacy of public health practices still relevant today. From quarantines to protective equipment, these historical strategies highlight humanity's ingenuity and resilience. Could you have survived, perhaps with a blend of preparation, adaptation and luck? Most people in medieval times never travelled more than 10 miles from their birthplace. That's like spending your entire life in your hometown without ever leaving. Roads were dangerous, and most peasants were bound to the land, working for their lords from sunrise to sunset. Think your apartment needs a deep clean? Medieval homes had dirt floors, no glass windows, and were filled with the lovely aroma of smoke, sweat, and, well, livestock. Hygiene? That was a luxury few could afford. Toilets, forget about them. Most people simply had a hole in the ground or used chamber pots, which were dumped, sometimes out the window, onto the streets. Yep, medieval streets were not a place you'd want to take a casual stroll. Forget fancy silverware. Forks weren't commonly used in medieval Europe. People ate with their hands, knives, and sometimes spoons. If you dined with royalty, you might get a napkin. Otherwise, it was all about licking your fingers clean. Believe it or not, women were the primary brewers of beer. Since water was often unsafe to drink, beer was the go-to beverage for all ages. Brewing beer was a household task, just like cooking or baking bread. The medieval work week? 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. Peasants worked long hours farming, tending livestock, and doing whatever their lord required. Sundays were a day of rest, and a much-needed break. Marriage in the Middle Ages happened early, sometimes as young as 12 for girls. Marriages were often arranged for economic or political reasons, not love. Romance novels had nothing on medieval reality. Think you can wear whatever you want, not in medieval times. Sumptuary laws dictated what colours and fabrics you could wear based on your social class. Peasants, earth tones, nobles, rich, vibrant hues. Medieval fairs were the highlight of the year. Think of them as a mix of a sports event, a music festival, and a wild party. Jousting, drinking, bear baiting, and live entertainment kept the crowds entertained. While peasants lived on bread and porridge, nobles feasted on extravagant dishes, swan, peacock, and even whale. Presentation was everything. Sometimes chefs would reassemble cooked birds with their feathers just for show,